Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have the literary critic James Wood versus Zadie Smith, author of White Teeth and On Beauty. This literary diss track takes place at the turn of the 21st century, but suffice to say it details a testy exchange of words regarding some severe criticisms of postmodern literature, and perhaps more interestingly, literature's aesthetic or even moral responsibility to the culture that gives it life. Before we launch into it, we need to first discuss postmodern literature. What is it? It's a notoriously difficult question to answer. When asked in an interview to do so, David Foster Wallace famously answered, after modernism. But postmodern literature is my area of scholarly expertise, so I'll offer an attempt at answering in some broad strokes. If you want a more detailed overview, I have a video for that. So to put it incredibly simply, postmodern literature came about after the end of World War II. We're talking Joseph Heller, John Barth, Vladimir Nabokov, William Gass, Thomas Pynchon, Don DeLillo. Broadly speaking, postmodern writers often share an absurdist sensibility they inherited from European existentialism by way of modernism. It translates into a paranoid aesthetic of living in a world that is not what it appears to be. So lots of conspiracy and labyrinthine webs of relations. Also, heightened interest in things like irony, nihilism, and dark humor as the only possible recourse within a meaningless and even hostile world. But on the level of the prose itself, postmodern literature often relishes its difficulty. If the world is impossibly complex, then literature ought to reflect that. So during the postmodern period, we return to some pretty acrobatic maximalism, resulting in some truly epic and impenetrable works like The Tunnel or Gravity's Rainbow, novels in which reality is blurred, answers are few and far between, and we struggle to make sense. This leads us into what I would consider to be reasonable critiques of postmodernism. For one, the canon is overwhelmingly white and male, and critics of postmodernism would argue that the white male's allure to this movement makes sense. There's a certain privilege in disengaging from social or cultural realities and retreating into language games and cynicism. Related to that, there's a criticism that postmodern literature can come across as self-indulgent, narcissistic, alienating for the sake of creating this ostensibly hyper-intelligent work that eludes comprehension. Now, there are numerous exceptions to all of these critiques, and we could debate them, but the point is that these are, at least in my mind, reasonable. But a new criticism comes around in 2000 with James Wood. He critiques a certain sort of novel of the era. While he never mentions the word postmodernism outright, it's clear that's his target, though it's a specific sort of postmodern literature that he calls hysterical realism. The novels he references as hysterical realism include mostly Zadie Smith's White Teeth, but he also discusses Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, Infinite Jest, Don DeLillo's Underworld, Rushdie's Midnight Children. And of these novels, he says, quote, "The big contemporary novel is a perpetual motion machine that appears to have been embarrassed into velocity. It seems to want to abolish stillness, as if ashamed of silence." It's worth stopping down to note what I perceive to be an essential irony throughout his missive, which is that in describing novels he decries as needlessly dense and opaque, his writing style is, well, dense and opaque. His argument essentially is that these big contemporary novels that are heralded as tour de force masterpieces are anything but, because they have no interest in the human. Without mentioning absurdism outright, he criticizes the huge and playful scope of these novels as examples of compensating the lack of character depth with sheer spectacle. The novels only pretend to be interested in realism, the lives of these characters, but it's actually a very shallow pool. The web of conspiracy and paranoia endemic to these novels betrays reality. Everything's too neat, too interconnected. He writes, quote, "An endless web is all they need for meaning. Each of these novels is excessively centripetal. The different stories all intertwine and double and triple on themselves. Characters are forever seeing connections and links and plots and paranoid parallels. That lack is the human. All these contemporary deformations flow from a crisis that is not only the fault of the writers concerned, but is now of some lineage, the crisis of character and how to represent it in fiction. Certainly the characters who inhabit the big, ambitious contemporary novels have a showy liveliness, a theatricality that almost succeeds in hiding the fact that they are without life. Liveliness hangs off them like jewelry." His main target, though, is Zadie Smith, whose talent he recognizes but would suggest it's wasted on this tradition that he despises. Quote, "Smith is a frustrating writer, for she has a natural comic gift, and yet is willing to let passages of her book descend into cartoonishness and a kind of itchy, restless extremism." Nonetheless, he does seem to respect Zadie Smith, at least enough to recognize her as representing a pivotal moment in literary development. Painting her as this sort of canary in the coal mine, he asks, quote, "Which way will the ambitious contemporary novel go? Will it dare a picture of life or just shout a spectacle?" Now, I have a whole lot of thoughts about all of this, but I'll say for now only that I agree with Woods' observations, and I very much like the designation of hysterical realism for its descriptive power, but I very much disagree with his conclusions based on those observations. Lucky for me, Zadie Smith would agree, and as usual, she puts it much better than I ever could. In an article for The Guardian entitled, "This is How It Feels to Me," Zadie Smith responded to James Wood's critique of her and others. As you'll see, the tone of her rebuttal is really effective. That not only makes James Wood look like the hysterical one, but it also presents Zadie Smith as the one who has taken the time to reason through the cause of this so-called hysteria driving her and others' fiction. Quote, "The critic James Wood appeared in this paper last Saturday, aiming a hefty, well-timed kick at what he called hysterical realism. It is a painfully accurate term for the sort of overblown manic prose to be found in novels like My Own White Teeth, and a few others he was sweet enough to mention. These are hysterical times. Any novel that aims at hysteria will now be effortlessly outstripped. This was Woods' point, and I'm with him on it. In fact, I've agreed with him several times before in public and in private, but I appreciate that he feared I needed extra warning." Then, with modesty, she makes an important point. Quote, "Any collective term for a supposed literary movement is always too large a net, catching significant dolphins among so much cannibal tuna." She continues, quote, "But even if this were not true, frankly, literature is, or should be, a broad church. Whatever the weaknesses of the various writers Wood mentioned, I don't believe he would wish for a literary landscape missing a book such as Rushdie's Midnight's Children or DeLillo's White Noise. The very books, in fact, which have cast such a tremendous shadow over two generations of American and English fiction. Yes, Jonathan Franzen's soon to turn up the corrections as a blatant attempt to redress that imbalance and return the intimate voice to a DeLillo-esque structure, but I wonder if even that isn't an artificial project. Anyone who follows this channel knows I love anyone dunking on Franzen, so yeah." She continues, quote, "We cannot be all the writers all the time. We can only be who we are," which leads me to my second point. Writers do not write what they want, they write what they can. Meaning, I think writers are shaped not just by other writers, but by the world that shapes them, a world that, in the 21st century, sure feels hysterical. She also takes to task Wood's preposterous notion that hysterical realism lacks humanity. She writes, quote, "I wonder sometimes whether critics shouldn't be more like teachers, giving a gold star or a black cross, but either way, accompanied by some kind of useful advice. Be more human? I sit in front of my white screen and I'm not sure what to do with that one. Are jokes inhuman? Are footnotes, long words, technical terms, intellectual allusions? If I put some kids in, will that help?" She also makes the necessary point that so-called hysterical realism is but a mimetic reflection of our world. Quote, "I want to defend the future possibility of some words appearing on pages that will be equal to these times and to what I feel and what you feel and what James Wood feels. That is, this fear that has got us all by the throat." He argues against silence and against intellectual obfuscation. He says, "Tell us how it feels." Well, we are trying. I am trying, but as DeLillo dramatized, again in White Noise, it is difficult to discuss feelings when the TV speaks so loudly, cries so operatically, seems always and everything one step ahead. And finally, quote, "Is it this reverence, this care, this suppression of ego that Wood wants to see from us? It is what I want to see for myself, but whether I will manage it is another matter. It will take sympathy, a natural instinct, a sentimental reflex, but it will also take empathy, which I still contend is largely a matter for the intellect." So let me know in the comments your thoughts on the debate between these two, and as always, order my new novel, Her New Eyes, wherever you get your books, and leave a review.